The Supreme Court has dealt a significant blow to the Trump administration, blocking the president from deploying the National Guard to Chicago. In the 6-3 ruling, the court's 3 liberal justices were joined by Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And today's decision could jeopardize Guard deployments in other cities. With us now, CNN senior legal analyst Ellie Holding is a former federal prosecutor. Walk us through the reasoning here from the Supreme Court, which I have to say is truly interesting.
It really is. It's an unusual decision and a major setback for the Trump administration, not just in Chicago, but more broadly. The law that Donald Trump used to deploy the National Guard in the first place says that the president can call out the National Guard if he is unable with regular forces, we're going to come back to that, okay, regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Now, the Trump administration argued that means if he's unable with regular cops, with FBI, DEA, ICE to enforce the laws, then you can call in the National Guard. What the Supreme Court said is, no. That phrase, regular forces, that means the regular military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and only those very narrow areas where the military is even allowed to come in and execute the laws in the first place. So basically, the Supreme Court has put the bar very high to deploy the National Guard in the future and has limited it to an almost minuscule slice of all conduct on the streets. It's going to make it very difficult for the president to justify the National Guard in Portland, New York, anywhere else.
Explain why this mattered in Chicago, but didn't play in Los Angeles or in Portland, Oregon, where the Guard was also deployed.
So I think you and I discussed Los Angeles and D.C. were different. D.C. was different. Trump was allowed generally to deploy there because the president is in charge of the D.C. National Guard, okay? Put that to the side. L.A. was different, Los Angeles, because there were protests that at times turned violent happening there. The rationale in Chicago is much more generalized. Just, well, crime rates are high and it's very dangerous. And the Supreme Court has said that's not enough for this specific statute.
Yeah, and again, for it to be allowed in cities like Chicago in these circumstances, it would have to get past posse comitatus, right?
Right.
Yes. Which means what?
You with your Latin phrases, which means that the military traditionally cannot conduct regular law enforcement activities. They can't make traffic stops. They can't do searches. They can really only provide a very basic security function. So it's very, very narrow. So this decision really leaves very limited room for Trump to deploy the National Guard elsewhere. They can try to argue circumstances are different, but if the argument's just going to be, well, it's dangerous, that's not going to cut it.
Let me tell you about a decision that just came down from the Supreme Court that represents a massive blow to Donald Trump's authoritarian ambitions and shows that maybe, just maybe, some of the checks and balances in our system are still functioning. The Supreme Court blocked Trump from deploying the National Guard to Chicago in a 6-3 ruling. And here's what makes this absolutely devastating for Trump's agenda. 3 of the conservative justices sided with the liberals against him. Chief Justice John Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, and Brett Kavanaugh all voted to shut down what Trump positioned as a signature policy initiative. This wasn't some narrow technical ruling. This was the Supreme Court putting up a massive roadblock to Trump's plans to militarize American cities and deploy federal forces against his own citizens. Let me break down exactly what happened here because the legal reasoning matters, and it has huge implications for Trump's ability to impose his will through military force going forward. Trump used a specific statute to justify deploying the National Guard to Chicago. That law says the president can call up the National Guard if he is unable with regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Pretty straightforward language, right? Trump's administration argued that regular forces means regular law enforcement, FBI agents, DEA, ICE, local police. So if those agencies can't handle crime in a city, the president can send in the National Guard to supplement them. But the Supreme Court said absolutely not. That's not what the statute means at all. When the law refers to regular forces, it's talking about the regular military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And it only applies in the very narrow circumstances where the military is even allowed to execute domestic laws in the first place, which under something called the Posse Comitatus Act is an extremely limited set of situations. Basically, the Supreme Court said Trump set the bar for deploying the National Guard incredibly low, claiming he could do it whenever crime rates are high. And the court responded by setting the bar incredibly high, limiting deployment to circumstances so narrow they're almost non-existent. Think about what that means going forward. Trump had announced plans to deploy the National Guard to multiple cities. Chicago was just the beginning. He explicitly said Memphis was next, that he was going to clean up crime in major cities, that he would use dangerous cities as training grounds for the military. He made military occupation of American cities a centerpiece of his law and order agenda. And the Supreme Court just told him he doesn't have the legal authority to do that. Not in Chicago. And based on this reasoning, probably not in Portland or New York or any other city where his justification is simply that crime rates are high and the situation is dangerous. This is huge. This fundamentally undermines one of Trump's signature campaign promises and governing strategies. He ran on being tough on crime. He promised to restore order to American cities. He threatened to send troops into Democratic-controlled urban areas to show them how real leadership handles public safety. And now the highest court in the land, including justices he appointed, has told him that's not legal. You can't deploy military forces domestically just because you think local law enforcement isn't doing a good enough job. The constitutional and statutory restrictions on domestic military deployment actually mean something. By the way, I am trying to do my best to gather all the information I can for you and share it with you. Please leave your likes and comments, and I would be grateful if you subscribed. Let's continue. The coalition that formed to block Trump is almost as significant as the ruling itself. We become so accustomed to 6-3 decisions where the 6 conservative justices vote as a bloc against the 3 liberal justices. That's been the pattern on virtually every major case since Trump's appointees gave conservatives a supermajority. But this case broke that pattern. Roberts, Barrett, and Kavanaugh sided with the liberals, leaving Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch in dissent. That's a remarkable fracture in the conservative bloc, and it happened on an issue Trump cares deeply about. Think about what that signals. 2 of Trump's own appointees, Barrett and Kavanaugh, voted against him on a core policy priority. They could have given him what he wanted. They could have interpreted the statute broadly to allow National Guard deployment wherever the president claims it's necessary. Instead, they joined with Roberts and the liberals to impose strict limits on presidential power. That's not the rubber stamp Trump expected when he appointed them. That's actual judicial independence, at least on this issue. And the fact that this was an emergency docket case makes it even more significant. There wasn't full briefing or oral arguments. The court had to make a quick decision based on limited submissions. In that context, justices often defer to the executive branch or decline to issue sweeping rulings. But here they didn't hesitate. They saw Trump trying to deploy military forces in American cities based on flimsy legal justification, and they shut it down immediately. That suggests they view this as a serious enough constitutional issue that it required urgent intervention. The distinction between Chicago and other deployments is important to understand. Los Angeles was different because there were protests that at times turned violent. The legal justification there had to do with immediate civil unrest requiring federal intervention. Washington, D.C. was different because the president has direct authority over the D.C. National Guard as a matter of law. But Chicago was purely about general crime rates being high and Trump wanting to flex federal muscle in a city run by Democrats he doesn't like. And the Supreme Court said, that's not enough. That doesn't meet the statutory requirements. That's not what the law allows. This ruling doesn't just affect Chicago. It jeopardizes Guard deployments Trump was planning in other cities. Every deployment where the justification is simply high crime rates and dangerous conditions now lacks legal foundation based on this decision. Trump can try to argue that circumstances are different in other cities, but if the argument boils down to it's dangerous and local authorities can't handle it, the Supreme Court has already said that's insufficient. The bar has been set. And it's set high enough that Trump's planned military occupations of American cities are likely dead in the water legally. Let's talk about what this means politically because the legal implications are only part of the story. One analyst pointed out that over the last 30 days, we've seen Trump's base of power cracking in multiple ways. Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of his most loyal supporters, broke with him over the Epstein files. Moderate Republicans like Brian Fitzpatrick have pushed back on other priorities. Senate Republicans rejected ending the filibuster. And now the Supreme Court, including his own appointees, has blocked a signature policy initiative. The entire Republican coalition is sensing weakness. That matters because Trump's power has always been as much about perception as reality. He projects strength. He demands loyalty. He threatens retaliation against anyone who crosses him. And that creates a self-reinforcing cycle where Republicans are afraid to oppose him because they think he's invincible. But when cracks start appearing, when Trump starts losing fights publicly, when even his Supreme Court appointees vote against him, that perception shifts. Suddenly, opposing Trump doesn't seem as dangerous. Suddenly, other Republicans start testing whether they can break with him without facing political destruction. And Trump doesn't respond well to being told no. He doesn't get chastened or moderate his approach. He gets angry and retaliatory and looks for ways around obstacles. So this Supreme Court decision probably won't make Trump rethink his authoritarian impulses. It'll make him angrier and more determined to find other mechanisms to impose his will. That's who he is. That's how he operates. Which means we should expect him to look for end runs around this ruling or to push even harder in areas where he thinks he has more legal authority. But here's the political problem Trump faces that this ruling exposes. While Americans generally support getting tougher on crime and fixing immigration problems, they don't support the specific cruel and authoritarian methods Trump is employing. People want safer cities. They don't want military occupation of those cities. They want immigration enforcement. They don't want ICE posting AI videos of Santa Claus deporting people as a Christmas message. There's a huge gap between the diagnosis of problems that resonates with voters and the solutions Trump is implementing. Let's talk about that ICE video for a second because it perfectly encapsulates everything wrong with Trump's approach to governance. ICE posted an AI-generated video on social media showing Santa Claus as one of its agents arresting and deporting an undocumented immigrant. The message reminded people that DHS is tripling financial incentives to $3,000 plus free airfare for any undocumented person who self-deports by the end of the year. So they created a Christmas-themed deportation propaganda video featuring Santa Claus as an ICE agent. Who is the audience for that? Who does the Trump administration think responds positively to weaponizing Christmas imagery to promote deportations? One analyst estimated maybe 10 to 20% of Americans might enjoy seeing content like that. The slice of MAGA that revels in punishment and cruelty, that treats inflicting pain on vulnerable people as entertainment, but that's nowhere near a majority coalition. Most Americans, even most Trump voters, don't want to see their government posting videos of Santa deporting people. That's not patriotism. That's not strength. That's just gross and cruel and dehumanizing. And this gets to the fundamental political miscalculation Trump is making. He won in part because he correctly diagnosed problems that Democrats were denying or minimizing. Crime in major cities is a real concern for many Americans, even if overall statistics show it's down from historical highs. The border situation before recent reforms was genuinely chaotic. Democrats lost credibility by claiming everything was fine when people's lived experiences told them otherwise. So Trump was right about identifying issues voters cared about. But being right about the problem doesn't mean being right about solutions. And Trump's solutions involve cruelty, dehumanization, military force, and authoritarian overreach that most Americans don't support. You can be concerned about immigration without wanting to see Santa Claus deporting people in government propaganda videos. You can want safer cities without wanting the National Guard patrolling your streets. There's a massive middle ground between Democrats denying problems exist and Trump's authoritarian approach to fixing them. And that middle ground is where most American voters actually live. The Supreme Court decision blocking National Guard deployment to Chicago represents the judicial branch finally checking executive overreach on this issue. But analysts are right to point out that we're seeing multiple institutions and political actors finally push back against Trump in meaningful ways. The courts are imposing limits. Congressional Republicans are breaking with him on specific issues. Even some MAGA loyalists are finding lines they won't cross. The firewall Trump came in with, where it seemed like nothing was off the table and he had unchecked power, is starting to crack. That's healthy for democracy. That's how the system is supposed to work. When one branch overreaches, the others check that power. When a president tries to do things that are illegal or unconstitutional, courts stop them. When a party leader pushes too far, members of his own party push back. We've been missing that dynamic for much of Trump's political career because Republicans have been too afraid or too complicit to provide meaningful oversight. So seeing it finally start to happen, even in limited ways, is significant. But we can't be complacent. Trump has shown repeatedly that he doesn't accept constraints on his power gracefully. He looks for workarounds. He ignores court orders. He fires people who won't do what he wants. So while this Supreme Court decision is a major victory for rule of law and constitutional limits on presidential power, it's not the end of the fight. Trump will keep pushing. He'll keep testing boundaries. He'll keep looking for ways to impose his authoritarian vision on American cities and American life. The question is whether institutions will keep pushing back, whether courts will continue imposing limits when Trump tries end runs around rulings he doesn't like, whether Republicans in Congress will maintain whatever spine they're developing or will fold the first time Trump threatens them, whether the checks and balances that are starting to check and balance will hold when Trump escalates his attacks on them. This Supreme Court decision suggests maybe they will. When even Trump's own appointees side against him on a core policy priority, that's a signal that at least some parts of our system are still functioning. It's not enough by itself. One ruling doesn't fix everything that's broken, but it's something. It's proof that unchecked presidential power isn't inevitable. It's evidence that legal constraints still mean something, even when a president tries to ignore them. So we should recognize this win while understanding it's one battle in a much longer war. Trump wanted to militarize American cities. The Supreme Court said no. That's important. That matters. But Trump isn't giving up on authoritarianism just because one avenue got blocked. He'll find others. And we need to be ready to fight those battles too, to support the institutions and individuals who stand up to overreach, and to keep demanding that the checks and balances our system depends on actually function the way they're designed to. Because the alternative is what we saw Trump trying to do in Chicago and planning for other cities. Military occupation based on nothing more than the president's claim that he knows better than local authorities how to handle public safety. Federal forces deployed against American citizens in American cities without the legal authority to do so. That's not law and order. That's authoritarianism. And the Supreme Court just reminded everyone, including Trump, that we're not there yet. Our system still has mechanisms to stop that. We just have to make sure those mechanisms keep working.